Okay, well, it's good to be with you again virtually, and I hope you're all doing well and are healthy. I wanted to give you a little mini lecture on essentially one of the papers that's one of the assigned readings for this week, which is Chapman and Chapman. It's an old paper that a lot of people in our field, the field of perception research in clinical populations and cognitive research in clinical populations, they cite this paper a lot. So this is a paper that a lot of people consider when they're doing their studies and when they're writing their papers. They want to acknowledge that they understand Chapman and Chapman when they're making their usually this paper comes up when you're making arguments about what your data mean. When you've collected your data, you have your results, and you're trying to make an argument for what they mean, and you have to say, and also Chapman and Chapman, I understand what that says, and this is why you should believe me when I say my data mean what I think they mean. So not everyone says Chapman and Chapman, but a lot of people do, and it's good for you guys to understand Chapman and Chapman for when you're writing your results, if you're in the lab section, or even when you're writing your proposal, to understand these guys is good. Or I think it's a guy and a girl. I'm assuming that they're married maybe, but who knows. But this is from 1973. It's an old paper, and it's still relevant today. So what is it talking about? Well, basically there's one thing you need to understand in the paper is the idea of, I'll write it over here, generalized deficit. So, by the way, there's like my to-do list over there and stuff, so that has nothing to do with anything you need to worry about. I just only have one whiteboard, and I don't want to erase my to-do list every time I make a video, so that's why that's still there. But what is a generalized deficit? So that's what Chapman and Chapman are interested in, and they're interested in making sure no one has like a confound going on in their study, or as they're trying to understand the results of their study, that's related to a generalized deficit. So what a generalized deficit is this is especially prevalent in schizophrenia, which is a very severe brain disease. A generalized deficit is when you are bad at everything. Any test you throw at a group of schizophrenia patients, it's likely they're going to perform below control subjects. They'll do worse, statistically significantly worse than controls. So, it doesn't matter. I could make this any number of tasks, but I'll have the schizophrenia group here, and the control group's going to be up here. And this is, I guess, group. So you have SC and NC, and then this is accuracy and you fill in the blank what task it actually is. It could be working memory, it could be visual motion perception, it could be face perception, lots of different kinds of perception, lots of different kinds of cognition. Any neuropsychological test, you throw at a group of schizophrenia patients. Not every schizophrenia patient will be bad at it, but a group of 30 of them are going to average out to be lower than a group of 30 controls, any test. So that's what we call a generalized deficit. And that could be a bunch of things contribute to a generalized deficit. One of them is symptoms of schizophrenia, and this would apply to other disorders as well, but we'll talk about schizophrenia as our main example here, which is that if you're hearing voices or you're paranoid about why is this research assistant having me in this study, what are they really up to, those symptoms are going to interfere with your ability to concentrate and do the task well. There's a good video on YouTube if you look for Anderson Cooper hearing voices, and he kind of goes through life one day with headphones on that are playing something simulating what auditory hallucinations are like, and it's just really unpleasant, first of all, but it also makes it so that he can't concentrate to do tests and stuff that they give him. So that's one aspect of the generalized deficit. Another aspect is that even beyond the traditional symptoms of schizophrenia is something that affects almost your whole brain, and there's lots of aspects of your brain that are different when you have schizophrenia. So they affect those differences may affect your performance on tasks. Also, if your brain is generally kind of less healthy and more taxed, as a result of that, or you're under more stress also because of your symptoms and stuff, or you may have been under more stress, which is partly why you have your symptoms. If you think of the diathesis stress model, you have less bandwidth to allocate attention to tests. So you have a generalized deficit in your ability to pay attention long enough to do any task well. So those are reasons why there's a generalized deficit. And you can also just take me at my word that there is a generalized deficit, that almost any task you throw at people with schizophrenia, they're not going to do well on. So that is sort of one of the problems that Chapman and Chapman are interested in addressing. And back in 1973, people had already figured out, well, here's one good way to address this problem of a generalized deficit. What if I showed that on my task that I'm interested in, this is the difference. It's a big difference. But I'm going to have a control task, which is the same thing. Control, real, my quote-unquote real task, like whether it's whatever I'm interested in, whatever I wrote my grant proposal on, right, and did it on visual perception or whatever. This is the real task, and this is the control task. And if I show that yeah, controls are a little bit better than patients on the control task, but they're a lot better than patients on the real task, then I can say, okay, these results here are not just from the generalized deficit, because the generalized deficit should be affecting the control task also, and there's a bigger difference here than here, so this is a specific deficit. So people get excited about a specific deficit. And that's actually how Chapman and Chapman start their paper in the abstract, is talking about how every year dozens of studies come out and they show specific deficits in schizophrenia. So in other words, now by 1973, people had figured out this kind of paradigm where I'm going to have my task of interest, but I'm also going to have a control task, and I'm going to show that there's a bigger difference between patients and controls in the real task. Okay? Now, even this scenario, which is good, it's better than having no control task, Chapman and Chapman have a problem with this. And I'll try and explain why there's a problem. They use some language in the paper that's a little bit jargony. This is a really good, really clear paper, but there's some stuff that if you haven't been to graduate school yet, you may not be familiar with, like alpha coefficients and stuff, and reliability. I know you learned a little bit about reliability and research methods, but I think we can try to understand what they're saying without needing to get too jargony. So I'm going to erase this, but hopefully you understand the generalized deficit and the idea of trying to show a specific deficit on your task of interest when you're doing a research project with people with schizophrenia or another patient group. So I'll just add this to our little vocabulary list here. Specific deficit. Deficit. Okay. So what's the other problem that they want to address? Well, what they're trying to say is that even if you do what I said, which is that you show there's a bigger deficit on your task of interest than on the control task, you might be your results may be driven by a confound, by this other thing that you didn't think of that really explains the results. It's not that schizophrenia patients are especially bad at your task. It's just that this other thing is causing it. And here's the other thing. Basically, it would probably be what we call a floor effect or a ceiling effect. So I'll write those down too, because these are important. And you may remember these from research methods. I would imagine this would be the type of thing Dr. Ade would have brought up with you or whoever was teaching the class at the time. But let's just review what that means. So if you have a group of people with schizophrenia and you measure their accuracy on something and you say, okay, look at that. People with schizophrenia are performing near 100% accuracy. And people with people who don't have schizophrenia are also performing at 100% accuracy. What can we conclude from this? Well, we can't conclude anything, because yes, I mean, you might be tempted to conclude that people with schizophrenia are good at whatever this task is. They can do it just as well as normal controls. But really, no, because your data are riddled with this ceiling effect here in this case. So what that means is that you're at the ceiling of possible accuracies. You're at 100%. You can't get any more accurate than that. So, I mean, your task is just basically too easy. It's not allowing the controls to shine and potentially do better than the schizophrenia patients because everyone's just performing at 100%. Like, imagine if I give you a task that was like, hey, can you please like point to the nearest window, like as a measure of your visual perception. I'm in a room right now with a window. I can point to it. So great, I do 100% accuracy. You bring in someone with schizophrenia, they're going to be able to point to the window too, and they get 100% accuracy. So does that mean there's no problem with visual perception in schizophrenia? Of course, it does not mean that. It means that my test was too easy to be sensitive to any deficits that may exist. Now, this is a ceiling effect. You could also have a floor effect, which is, what if I show this? That people with schizophrenia perform at 0% accuracy on something, and people who are normal controls also perform at 0% accuracy on that same thing. Well, you know, if I make my task too difficult, this would be what would happen. So what's an example of a really difficult task? You know, if I ask people, okay, so say you have 5 seconds to do this division problem in your head, 757,000 divided by 412. You know, most people aren't going to be able to do that in 5 seconds. So everyone's going to get they're going to get it wrong. And say I have 20 problems just like that. Everyone would get them all wrong. So it would look like there's no difference in accuracy between controls and patients. But really, this is just a floor effect. That your patients are already at the bottom of possible accuracies, so they can't do any worse than the controls are doing, who are also at the bottom of any possible accuracies. This is the floor effect. So that's really what Chapman and Chapman, the main point I want you to take from this paper is about floor and ceiling effects, is that just make sure both your real task of interest and your control task they're not subject to floor or ceiling effects. Make sure that the accuracy of both groups is somewhere in the middle, okay? So they talk about this with with just vocabulary words with kids and 5th graders versus 3rd graders. I mean, look at this. So this is the percent correct on vocabulary, like a vocabulary test, and these are really hard vocabulary words, and these are easier and easier and easier vocabulary words. So if you take a really easy vocabulary word, look, 3rd and 5th graders perform the same. They both perform 100% correct. And if it's a really hard vocabulary word, they both perform the same. They both perform at 0% correct. It's in the middle where you see the biggest difference between 3rd graders and 5th graders, where you get 20% accuracy for 3rd graders, 50 or 60% accuracy for 5th graders. That's a 40% difference between the groups if you have a moderately difficult vocabulary set of vocabulary words. So that's exactly what you want to do when you're designing your task. Of course, you're just gonna you don't have to talk about this very much in your proposal, but just as you're thinking about it, make sure that your task is going to be challenging but doable for the controls. They're going to get some wrong. They're going to get some right. And then hopefully your patients are also going to get some wrong and some right if you're trying to show a specific deficit, if that's the type of study you're doing. You want your task to be moderately challenging, so that accuracy is somewhere here, somewhere between chance accuracy and perfect accuracy. So this would be like 50% accuracy. If you're doing a study like, remember Yu Chen's study, the 1999 psychophysical isolation of motion, of velocity discrimination deficit in schizophrenia, that one chance accuracy is 50% because they're guessing left or right on each trial. So if they can't see it at all, they'll get 50% accuracy just by guessing. So in that study, he would want his accuracy to be somewhere around 75%, somewhere between the floor of 50% and the ceiling of 100. That's what you kind of want to shoot for. So that's what you should shoot for your task of interest, but also, and this is very important, for your control task. You want both the control task and the task of interest to be set at the same difficulty level, basically. And then, if you show that people with schizophrenia, or whatever your patient group is, this is what you want to show. That so task of interest, control task, CTRL task. You want to show that, say we have a 50, well, so say chance accuracy is 50%, but we'll still go down to 0 on our graph. So this is what you want to show. You want to show that normal controls, maybe ideally it would be like right about here, like right around 80% accuracy. And normal controls are right around 80% accuracy on this other control task as well. And then patients, task of interest, if they are like down to 60% accuracy, that will be a big difference. But then here, they're the same as controls. Then this is extremely convincing that you have a real specific deficit on your task of interest, but not on the control task here. And that these results are not driven by a generalized deficit. It's not just that they're hearing voices. It's not that their whole brain is messed up. It's not that they are having trouble paying attention because their brain is taxed. It's a specific problem with whatever this task is. Because guess what? This task is just as challenging. Look, the controls are equally accurate over here on the control task, but the patients do not show a deficit here. Okay? So all the generalized deficit stuff applies to this control task, and there's no deficit here. So this situation really does demonstrate a specific deficit on whatever your task is. And that is totally what Chapman and Chapman are trying to say, is that just make sure that your control task has, it's not subject to floor effects or ceiling effects. They also say make sure it's equally reliable, which don't even worry about that for now because it's hard to, that's more complicated than we need to get for this class and the proposals that you're making. Just worry about floor and ceiling effects. And you don't have to write very much about that in your proposal, but it's just something to keep in mind if you want to mention it. In your methods section, say, not for your specific aims page, but for your methods section, if you say, you know, I'm going to make sure the accuracy levels of both my control task and my task of interest are moderately difficult, that would be great. And you cite Chapman and Chapman. That's probably a good thing to do. Now, not all of you are doing this exact design where you have the specific deficit you're trying to show, but a lot of you probably are. So a lot of you can probably make use of the Chapman and Chapman thing. And maybe possibly all of you, I'm not sure. All right. Well, let me know if you have questions. Shoot me an email or write a comment on the page here, and I hope this was helpful.